In the previous section, I suggested that there was a way of engaging theologically with this question of human uniqueness, which could be in strong concert with a scientific understanding, and would begin with an enthusiasm for all kinds of created life. In this final section, I want to ask the question about whether or not there are ethical implications of this theological and scientific perspective that begins to see human beings alongside other animals rather than wholly distinct from them. So if we need to think of human beings as definitely unique, but unique in the sense that every kind of created life is unique, so we have our own particular characteristics, but we are one among many of the kinds of life on this earth and perhaps beyond. And that theologically we are, valued by God, but as part of this immense and diverse creative project. If we take that kind of attitude to the scientific discoveries and a Christian theological perspective, I want to ask whether or not there are some particular ethical implications that confront us. Now, the kinds of extraterrestrial questions we began with are one way of thinking about the ethics of our encounter with other than human life. So H.G. Wells portrayed a conflictual response, Martians coming as aggressive invaders and human beings responding with military might to try and prevent them taking over the Earth. Apologies for the spoilers, but Denis Villeneuve's Arrival takes a more optimistic account and perspective of the kind of encounter we might have with other than human life. But you can see that these are ways, as are other scientific science fiction engagements with extraterrestrial life, of thinking about the ethics of how we engage with other than human life. There might be similar ethical questions that arise with questions about human evolutionary origins. So some theologians, philosophers, ethicists have said, well, what would be our moral responsibility if we discovered, still existing on Earth today, some kind of close human neighbour, some Neanderthal, for example, or Homo erectus, that was quite close to what it meant to be a human being, but not a member of species Homo sapiens. So that kind of thought experiment of discovering non-Homo sapiens life presents another kind of ethical question, this encounter with this non-human other. But I want to suggest that perhaps even more interesting and potentially of much more immediate practical relevance is thinking about our ethical encounter with the kinds of non-human life which we know are around us here and now. So there's one sense in which we could think of the other animals that we're living among and our relationships with them as an immediate context for thinking ethically about what it might mean to take seriously the kinds of scientific and theological insights about thinking about what it means to be human and to be in relationship with other than human life. So if our fellow animal creatures in a theological perspective are the good creation of God, if they are willed by God to glorify God in their flourishing, as the biblical and theological perspectives that I've reviewed seem to suggest, if they will be gathered up in Christ together with all things in heaven and earth, as the opening of the Ephesians and Colossians suggest. And we could add Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 8, where he talks about the whole of creation liberated from its bondage. So if we take that kind of theological view of other than human animals, and if we see that alongside a scientific understanding that reminds us that the cognitive capacities of other animals are far more developed than we have previously recognized, and that their social and cultural lives are far more interesting and sophisticated than we've thought, then perhaps we need to radically rethink the kinds of ways that we make use of other animals. We need to radically rethink the ethics of our relationships with these non-human others. So it's very clear that at the moment we are needlessly cruel to billions upon billions of animals that we're making use of for food. So most humans these days could get by on a plant-based diet. If you're living in sub-Saharan Africa and you're a sort of tribal herder, then you might be strongly dependent on animal products. But for most human beings living on the planet, there are ready sources of nutritionally adequate plant-based food. Which means that we don't actually need to make use of other animals for food at the moment. But we're making use of other animals far more extensively than we have done previously. And we're using them in ways that are radically novel. Especially since the mid-20th century, we've developed technologies that are engaging farmed animals in ways that reshape their lives and their bodies in order to maximize their efficiency for human food purposes. This is epitomized in the life of a broiler hen. These are chickens that are being raised for meat. And I visited one site where this was going on, and what we've done is modified the genetics of these hens so that they can put on weight so quickly that we could slaughter them for meat at only 35 days old. And so in the broiler facility I visited, I stood in a huge warehouse which was completely dark except for the artificial light, which was manipulated in order to maximize their growth rates. And I was surrounded by 24,000 hens, all of whom had been delivered as day-old chicks into sort of one end of this facility. And I was able to hold one single chicken that was 16 days old, just losing its fluffy chick feathers and growing its mature white feathers. And that straggly chick, 16 days old, was halfway through its life. And as it would grow older in the next couple of weeks, it would become more and more uncomfortable because its legs were insufficient for supporting this sort of prematurely mature body, and then it would be swept up at the end of that period, thrown into crates and taken down the motorway for a couple of hours for an unpleasant experience of slaughter. So that's what it means to be raising chickens intensively, but we also raise other kinds of animals, especially pigs, in an intensive context, which subjects these cognitively developed and socially very sophisticated animals to very monotonous environments in which their tails have to be docked to stop them eating each other's tails out of mere boredom. So if we try and put those current human food practices in the context of the scientific and theological questions we've been thinking about in terms of the relationship between human beings and other animals, it seems to me we might have quite serious reasons for rethinking what we're currently doing. It seems to me that if we become suspicious about the affirmations of sort of human uniqueness that have often been associated with Christian theology and have been so much part of long traditions of philosophical inquiry, we might have to think very seriously about whether we are committing some kind of radical ethical wrongness in the way we're currently using other animals for food. So perhaps one of the ethical fruits of engaging seriously with this question of human uniqueness might be to think again about our use of other animals for food in these ways. Perhaps we ought to think about adopting a vegan diet in which human beings who are capable of it, which I've suggested is almost all of human beings alive today, could decide no longer to make use of other animals for food, which incidentally would bring all kinds of benefits for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing environmental pollution, enhancing human health, avoiding our exposure to various possibilities of virulent diseases from swine flu or bird flu, and avoiding problems with antibiotic resistance. Perhaps there would be a significant challenge arising from this question about human uniqueness, which should make us think again about that. Or even if we're not ready to engage with a vegan diet, perhaps we ought to think seriously about the ethics of intensively reshaping the lives of these other than human creatures into ways that are ever more convenient for our own use. You may be interested in having a look at my project called CreatureKind, which you can find at becreaturekind.org, which tries to engage Christians with the ethics of farmed animal welfare as a faith concern, very much along the lines of responding to this ethical challenge that I'm describing.